All right. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, evening for the folks in other time zones. Okay, so I wanted to check in with you about this class and trying to figure out the mind. I know some people still have not figured out how to connect their mind tap to the Canvas course. And one student that I spoke with earlier said that she made sure when in her profile on Cengage, she made sure that she indicated that she was a student at Wake Forest University. So I think you may need to, that may be a step that some people are missing, that you when you're creating your profile, you connect it to Wake Forest University to say that you're a student there and you're affiliated there. And then it should be able to find the courses that you're enrolled in and connect it to your Canvas site. Um, I have not had to go through the process that you all are going through. I had to go through a different process as an instructor. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be much help on how to get that set up. But the other things that you can do are to email Cengage. They have been actually pretty responsive over email. And then they also have this like tutorial videos. Um, Now, the activation key, I provided the course key in Canvas. And then there's also a key that, or like a code that you're supposed to get once you purchase the textbook that you can input. Um, Beyond that, I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm going to be much help. So if you have problems, even after this little bit of information, please email me so that I can forward it. I'll try to forward it to our technology person in the sociology department to see if he can help, because he was the one who kind of helped me get everything connected. And so that's the only other option that I know of right now. Okay, so I want to just also check in with you about chapters 1 and 2. And I'm going to upload some PowerPoints. This is the idea behind the chapters is that it just kind of gives you a broad overview of the content of sociology, just kind of getting an understanding of how we think about sociological world, how we think about the world through a sociological lens. And I think a lot of people don't really know what sociology is or what it means. And so I would say, that sociology is about critical thinking. It helps you to think about, okay, these are the things that happen in society and in my life. And we kind of take it for granted that that's the way things are supposed to be, or that that's the way things have always been. But uh, from sociology, you can kind of see different philosophies and on trying to understand how does this world evolve into the world that we live in today. So a lot of the examples I will give are going to be of the United States, but we can think about this and applying this across history and across context, countries, cultures, right? So in the context of the United States, and I think this is a perfect time to think about this, right? We have an election, we have, all these issues around immigration, we have racial conflict right now. Um, we have, just the pandemic and just thinking about like health disparities. A lot of that stuff is happening in the news right now. People talking about, access to healthcare, access to the internet, access to transportation, and being able to work and being able to stay at home. Thinking about, okay, so let me just stick on one example, right? So one thing that we think about with the United States is it's a diverse country, right? and a lot of people talk about it as the melting pot. Um, when you think about the United States, how do you think that it became that way? We all know kind of the history of, you know, uh, American Indians were here and had been here for centuries, and then Europeans started exploring and quote unquote discovered the America, and then they started to migrate to this new land. And they also brought people of African ancestry against their will to the United States. So we all kind of know that history. But how did the rest of like Asian and how did these other groups, how did we get Hispanic, right? Where is that even, like, how did we get Asian groups here? How did we get African and Caribbean groups here? How did we get Middle Eastern groups here? So that story of immigration, you know, we talk about it as like, oh, come to America and bring your immigrants, bring your poor, bring your downtrodden, bring your oppressed to the United States, and it's the land of the free and all of that, right? However, there's another kind of history that isn't told as often. And a big part of that is thinking about the laws that have been put into place, the policies that have been put into place to control who is able to immigrate to the United States or not over time. So in the 1800s, there were quite a few Chinese immigrants who were coming to the United States. And they moved to California and the West Coast to help build the railroads. And the United States was like, yes, come on, bring your workers, come here and work. But then the Chinese decided they wanted to stay and they wanted to own land and create a life here. And then the US government was like, nope, you're not doing that, right? And so they made laws that prohibited Chinese Americans from being able to own land. And, you know, and so then that kind of, and they also made distinctions with those laws on who could own land. And they made it very specific to white men and women. Well, white men at that point. Women were not allowed to own land at that point. So there's kind of a prescription, right? This de facto kind of lawmaking process that kept certain population from being able to stay and own land and create a life, which then controlled how we develop the diversity, right? So like there's a minority of Asian Americans in the United States, but it's not just by happenstance. It does, part of that process has happened because of the laws that we've created, right? And then after that, they started to close the borders. Similar to, I don't know if you remember, you know, just a couple of years ago, currently making laws that prohibit, or policies that prohibit certain populations from migrating or immigrating to the United States. Recently, it's been from Middle Eastern countries and African countries that keep people, and from Mexico and Latin American countries, from being able to migrate and immigrate to the United States on a large scale. So those laws were set in place from the 1800s all the way through 1965. And yet at the same time, they did not have those laws that prohibited European immigrants to the United States. And so you had this large influx of Irish, British, Eastern European migrants who came to the United States. And yet all the other groups were prohibited, or there was quotas on who could, how many people could come each year. And so it was like something as low as like 1% per population. So it's very low percentage. And so that kind of created, it was a manufacturing of the majority. So when, we talk about majority and minority, right? Where do those words come from? How are those words created, and what do they really mean? And so that's just one example of many that we could think about when we're thinking about sociological analysis of a fact, of a thing that we take for granted, of something that exists in our world today, that we think is just, oh yeah, we have racial diversity and there's a majority white and then there's racial ethnic minorities, right? So we kind of take those terms for granted, but how did those terms come into play? How did they get created throughout this process of history, laws? And then you can start to look at the data, right? To think about, okay, so part of the sociological imagination is not only questioning things that exist in our world, but also using a certain method to be able to analyze and get to a truth. And so, I think what's interesting about those chapters too is that we talk about truth. How do we know what's true or not? And how do we know how society functions, right? And there's so many different theories about how society functions. So, we talk about this kind of like functionalist approach to society where everybody has a role, and, we have kind of, for example, an upper class, a middle class, and a low income kind of strata in society. And in the United States, everybody likes to think of themselves as middle class. And, it's kind of a hybrid between this functionalist society where, yes, we have current infrastructure, where we have economic division, we have the political division, we have people who, especially now, you think about essential workers, right? You have people who are essential to the functioning of society. Educator, and our definition of essential has changed during COVID. Thinking about education, people who are educators, they are definitely essential. People who are sanitation workers, definitely essential. People who, maintenance workers and healthcare workers. I am in healthcare. I am essential, right? So yes, that does make sense. And I think it does kind of help explain society in general. But there's also other things that happen, right? Because not every society functions the same. And then also as you move from city to city or from country to country, you'll see that even though we have this kind of general infrastructure that you can see the patterns across society, you will see that there are some cultural differences or some nuances that come into play. And so how do we help explain that, right? And so that's where this idea of symbolic interaction and conflict theory also come into play. Because through this, through the functioning of society and these kind of like different stratas of society, statuses like economic status and racial status and gender status and and sexuality status, all of these different statuses, they do kind of help shape our identity, and it also shapes our opportunity. So just because a society functions in a certain way, we also have these ideals that, especially in the United States, this idea that people are able to work themselves up through society and out of their current function in the society, right? So that if someone were born as a low-income person, the narrative in the United States is that they should be able to work them, pull up their bootstraps and work and get out of that current role and move up in society. And they could eventually become wealthy like the top 1%. However, when we look at the data and history, that narrative is not necessarily true. And it's definitely not true for the majority of Americans. But it also, that opportunity to move up in society differs by different statuses. It differs by gender, sexual orientation, religion, to a certain extent. Most people in the United States are Christian, so that hasn't really affected people as much as racial, ethnic status, right? So those, when you look at the data, then we start to think about, okay, so that's the question, right? Does our society and our ideals of being able to move up and have social mobility and economic mobility in the United States, does that actually hold true? So that would be the research question. I'm now I'm combining chapter 1 and chapter 2, right? So that would be the research question. And then we want to go and look and get data. So this would be this kind of deductive reasoning, right? Deductive reasoning is that you have this question, you have a theory, and you want to go get data to confirm that theory, right? So then we'd say, okay, we have census information, we have surveys that we could ask, people about their education status and their income and their wealth and their experiences with their parents and how their parents taught them about savings and those kinds of things. And then what kind of job are they pursuing and all of those things, right? So those questions, that information can help us better understand on a larger scale across society and across different statuses how people are able to move up in society or not. I'm going to send you all a link to this video, and it shows, unfortunately, how the wealth divide has grown. It's actually larger now, the divide between the top 1% and us, the low income and middle class, that divide has grown over time. And it's even wider now than it was during the Great Depression in the 1920s. So, this myth of being able to move up and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it does happen for some people, but for the majority of Americans, it does not happen. Most people stay in the same socioeconomic status throughout their lives, and generationally, it also there's this maintaining of that status. There may be a few people who trickle up, and there's kind of exceptions to that rule, but the current way that our society is set up, unfortunately, is that most people are not going to become that top 1%. And so using data and observation, kind of surveys, interviews, to better understand how and why that happens is a part of the sociological method and imagination, and kind of understand it, thinking critically about how those things happen. So just want to give y'all those kinds of tidbits to help you kind of tie all this new terminology, these new words, the new ways of thinking together. Also, I'm going to do a separate video because I know it may be too long for you to kind of figure out all the information, but I'm going to do a separate video about the kind of updated changes to the syllabus and answer some questions that I've seen in emails. All right. I look forward to reading all of your reflections and your videos. And let me know if you need anything else. I'm always open for office hours. I've updated the office hours on my calendar. So feel free to reach out. I'm here.